This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with LeRhonda Manigault-Bryant, who teaches in the Department of African American, and Diaspora Studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her work is invested in history, spirituality, and memory, with a particular focus on African American women and religion. To that end, she is the author of Talking to the Dead, Religion, Music, and Lived Memory Among Gullah Geechee Women from 2014, and has edited two books, Womanist and Black Feminist Responses to Tyler Perry's Productions with Carol B. Duncan and Tamara Lomax from 2014, and Fat Religion, Protestant Christianity and the Construction of the Fat Body with Lynn Gerber and Susan Hill from 2021. In this conversation, we discuss the place of historical and religious study in Black studies, spiritual practice as Black study, and how questions of gender and region transform our approach to the field. Good afternoon, Ron. How are you today?
I'm doing great. John, how you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm so excited that we had time to talk. We were just chatting before I hit record. We go back a bit. We were both Amherst-Williams rivalry. We can put aside for whatever UNC and University of Maryland might have going on. I was really excited that we've managed to find some time to have this conversation. I think for a lot of reasons, your voice is a really important one to have on the series. I think that the work you do is extremely interesting, and so that alone. Also, one of the things that my co-founder Ashley Newby and I have really wanted to do is get people in religious studies on the podcast. I think this is such an undervalued and underdocumented part of the field of Black studies. So that's also a hugely important part of getting your voice on the series. And you have a professional microphone, so we can be like Studio Black Studies today.
We can be Studio Black Studies. I'm here for it all day.
So just a way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really look forward to talking with you.
Thank you. It's so glad to be here. And it's I love that this has given us an excuse to reconnect, because that was probably over a decade ago that we first connected. But it's really good to be back in touch.
Don't count years.
Okay.
It was a couple years back.
Just a few.
Sure, I've been here 6 years, but that was a couple years back in Massachusetts.
Just a few.
So obviously we'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you imagine the field of Black studies and these kinds of questions. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask you, what was it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always the sort of companion piece to that is what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
That's a really great question. I mean, I would say that for me, I have to go back actually a little bit to before my life, even as an academic. So my just kind of path has been really circuitous, I would say, and not particularly linear. And sometimes that's been a really great thing. I think that's benefited me in wonderful ways. But I also think that sometimes meant that people don't always kind of know what to do with how it is that I'm thinking about my work because of that circuitousness. So I want to go back a little earlier, though, because I did my undergraduate career at Duke. And at Duke, I was a history major, and I double minored in political science and African American studies. So right there, you have some really important formation stuff that was happening, right? And I went to Duke from the South Carolina Lowcountry. So I grew up, steeped in the ways, in the cadences, I would say the spiritual imaginations of Black women. So that, formation, which is for me intellectual and regional, like really shaped me in profound ways. So that also meant that I always have understood myself as being accountable to the worlds that have made me. So that for me meant that religion and the questions that animate religion were never far from my mind. So when I think about what that's meant for my work, it's really meant that my work has unfolded in these kind of four overlapping circuits, these kind of cycles. And so like that first, kind of movement of that first cycle, the first kind of movement, it really lives like most clearly in Africana religious studies and Black religious studies. So I was and always am interested in how members of the Black diaspora, and especially Black women, like understand religious encounter. What does it mean to think about the sacred? What does it mean to think about value and faith and meaning, and how are we carving that out in our lives? But one of the things that meant for me is that I realized that the category of religion itself was too narrow in some ways. So because Black women's experiences from my own, again, time in the South Carolina Low Country to the ways that I was thinking about my own just kind of matriculation through life at Duke, and then I did my graduate work at Emory, my understanding and experience of the sacred didn't always kind of fit institutional definitions, right? These formal definitions. So instead of kind of squeezing those experiences into those existing frameworks within religious studies, I tried to push them. So I think of my first book, Talking to the Dead, as an example of that, right? So I'm thinking about religion, I'm thinking about music, I'm thinking about lived memory, I'm thinking about the Gullah Geechee, and I'm asking what counts as religious knowledge, as religious memory, as religious sound, as ancestral presence. I'm thinking about those things. So I'm holding that, let's hold that, kind of movement. And then there's another movement, which is really turning towards womanist and Black feminist thought, right? So especially around questions of embodiment. So how does Black feminist storytelling, how does it connect us to intergenerational and ancestral, I would even say epistemologies, like ways of knowing? So I was drawn to womanist and Black feminist, theory, certainly because of my work as a scholar of religion, right? I mean, we think about womanism in particular within religious studies, but also, again, that formation, I was going to church every Sunday as a kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
With my grandmother, with my mother in particular. And it's not that my father wasn't there, because he was, but there was a particular kind of acculturation around women's lives, right? That was always there. So it made sense for me that, as I got to know more from African American studies and poli-sci and being a history major at Duke, that, I was thinking already about kind of Black feminisms, and as I became a scholar of religious studies and womanism, right? So I'm thinking about, disrupting kind of gender studies in that way, right? And so I think about my work in that. I guess that's technically my most recent book publication, which is Fat Religion, right? That I co-authored with my wonderful fat sisters, I think that work in particular is like, a good example of that intervention. And then there's like another shift, right? A third movement into popular media, right? So I was wrestling with race and gender and religion and embodiment, all of these things, how they're represented in broader cultural forms. So this is the work on Tyler Perry. I'm thinking about theological frameworks. I'm thinking about how those theological frameworks are influencing production, shaping, I would even say, kind of popular constructions of how Black women in the popular imagination are read. So I also then kind of moved to thinking about how religion is embedded and how Black feminist and womanist discourse really helps us to read those depictions more carefully, more creatively, more critically. And then lastly, and hear me out, I know this is like a long answer to this question, but it's important because when I think about that formation and I think about those cycles, it really gets to what keeps me right in the work that I do. So I would say the last movement has been about translation and synthesis. Like, how do I take the interdisciplinary inquiry of religious studies and womanist and Black feminist thought and thinking about embodiment and popular culture and how do I translate that to broader public. So that looks like curating, right? I was the
Mm-hmm.
lead kind of curator on, 50 years of Africana studies at Williams, right? I led that before I left. It's looked like, kind of writing for the publics of the New York Times about my mom and about mortality. It's looked like formal training in documentary filmmaking. And I founded my own production company called Contra Girl Blue, right? I wanted to make, and I continue to want to make, Black women's stories more accessible beyond the academy. So when I think about these movements, right, to get to your question, they've been overlapping and circuitous and not linear. The through line is the same. I've
Mm-hmm.
always been propelled by questions about how Black folks navigate the sacred.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also always followed those threads. And so rather than being bound by a discipline, um, I've just followed the questions. And that instinct to move and to synthesize and to translate is what really brought me fully into Black studies. And I would say what keeps me there.
I love that. I mean, it's funny you apologize for it being a long answer. That was an amazing answer. I mean, and I was thinking so much as you were talking about how, in this really productive way, you were describing this wandering or kind of nomadic, sort of
Yeah.
curiosity driven, or driven by something. And I was like, "What's the name for that?" And you just came back to it at the end, right? This thread that holds it
Yeah.
together, and
Yeah.
the way multiple media, right, multiple kinds of intellectual practice end up being not a way of like reckoning with or describing that childhood, right? That South Carolina low country world and
Mhm.
religious world in particular, but instead this is like, as you said, this sort of one continuous kind of movement, threaded, but also wandering at the same time. I mean, that's, what you described in so many ways is exactly what is the Black Studies promise, right? People, I think it's easy to say
Yes.
multidisciplinary and say, I have some history books, I have some novels, but what you're talking about is really an engagement with so many of the possibilities
Yeah.
of.
That notion of promise, I think, is right on because I mean, that's what Black studies and Black life, study Black life gets us to do, right? Yeah.
Let me ask you then, just to, in some ways, I think it's a continuation of from what you were just saying, to ask you how you then think about and imagine the field of Black studies. Like, what's that portrait that you work with? Because it has that tension in its origin point, right? The demand by students in the late 1960s, early 1970s that there be a place on campuses to do something that disciplinary departments had failed to do, which was provide a rigorous and systematic and sustained study of Black life. But also, of course, that time period, right, the late 1960s, early 1970s, the radicalization of Blacks' liberation struggle
Mm.
had really complicated some of those boundaries between campuses and communities, between books and prescriptive action, between study and political mobilization. And I think we inherit that in this sort of political demands that come with Black studies for a certain kind of relation to community and liberation. But we also have that commitment in the field to the study of the intellectual tradition. And
Mm.
I think there's a tension there. I never want to call it a contradiction, but there's a tension. And I'm interested sort of in that context, how you imagine the field and what portrait sort of guides you in this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I love that framing because when I think about Black studies, I think about a field that was never meant to sit still. Right? It's a
Mm,
field that was born
I
moving.
love that.
So it's, this idea of wandering, this nomadic sensibility. I mean, yeah, I think it's spot on. I mean, yes, Black studies certainly emerged out of activism, right? Students and communities demanding. Universities need to recognize Black life as worthy of study, as worthy of protection, as worthy of intellectual rigor, right?
Mm.
So the political impact, of Black studies is not just like an accessory to the field. It's really foundational. But what I love and what I think we sometimes forget, John, is that Black studies didn't simply respond politically, right? It didn't stop at protests. It also built, I think, this really important intellectual tradition. It
Yeah.
named a canon. It also, though, cultivated aesthetic practices. It nurtured theory. It has created spaces where Black thought could be rigorous, but also expressive and also generative. And I would say on its own terms. So I think of that not necessarily as a contradiction, but as like a dual inheritance. You know, I think of it as like community commitment, intellectual production. And again, when I think about my own intellectual journey, it absolutely mirrors that, right?
Yeah.
Because I've always followed those questions, how Black women experience the sacred. I've been forced to, in fact, move across disciplines, right? Africana religious studies alone wasn't enough. Gender theory alone wasn't enough. Media studies alone wasn't enough. Confinement, in some ways versus freedom. And that, I think, is what, Black studies does at its best. It like refuses these narrow boundaries. Now, we have the other challenge of like what it means to define a field, right? We get sometimes bogged down in that. But I think, if we think about Black studies as always always moving, right? Very nomadic, I think that Black studies provokes freedom. It provokes, it provokes a sense of limitlessness and futurity. And so, I think Black studies as its best makes that movement possible. So like, that relationship for me between political impact and intellectual tradition, it's not a tension to resolve. I think of it as a rhythm to maintain.
I love that.
Yeah, like if we only are political, but we don't have intellectual depth, we're not going to have the complexity that we need. If we're only intellectual, but without political consequences, we're not going to have the accountability that we're supposed to have. So I think the field has to keep cultivating brilliance, right? We have to keep moving. We have to create these rhythms and polyrhythms. I mean, theory, archive, storytelling, art. We have to do all of those things. But I also think it's important to remain rooted and accountable to the communities that help call Black studies into being. I think it should be porous. I think it should be that movement that you were talking about between campus and community. I also don't think we can and should lose that, right? I think that movement is the lifeblood to Black studies.
That's fantastic. Born moving is going to be a phrase that I really hold on to from this conversation going forward as a way of talking about Black studies. And I love the way that sort of sense of movement. Then you also came to tension as thinking tension as rhythm. Yeah, I'm glad I asked that question.
Me too. And it's so funny because like you full disclosure to the audience, right? I mean, you give questions, but I didn't write them out. I just kind of thought about them a little bit, and that one came to me in real time. You probably could see me. I was like, oh yeah, it's it's rhythm. In fact, it's always moving. It's like it's yeah.
No, I'm glad it came to you. This is Born Moving. I'm going to message Ashley when we get done with this. She's going to love that too. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let me ask a little bit about your work then. You've talked a bit about it, about sort of contours of your work, and you have interests in cultural history, questions of gender, and of course, sensibilities that are really rooted in religious studies. And, those come together to produce really, really interesting work. I mean, just for what it's worth, your first book had a huge impact on me. I really love it. Extremely interesting book. And so
thank you. We don't write those books to do what they do for kind of popular books. I always love hearing that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, no, it really did. It made me think a lot about a lot of things, language, expressive media, all those sorts of things. But so I'm interested to hear how just your, and this may also go into the sort of media that are important for you in doing this work, but that collage of ideas produce so many insights into Black life. And I'm interested how you think of your sort of set of critical frames that you work with and the work that you do, how you see it and how it fits in the history of the field of Black studies, sort of where's it situated in that history, but also what boundaries you think it pushes or what new horizons you hope that it opens up.
Yeah, I mean, I see my work as being deeply indebted, right, to religious studies, for sure, right? Because those foundational questions that really held the through line for me in terms of all of the ways that I have moved, have been really important because they keep me literally rooted in finding deep, purposeful meaning, right? Like, so it's never just like, oh, let me just do this for the sake of doing it. Like, there has to be a deep, substantive meaning behind it, right? So I'm really indebted to the work and the framing of religious studies and all of the kind of methods that religious studies affords, scholars of religion to access. But I'm also, indebted to Black feminism and womanist traditions because of the ways that they insist that Black women's lives are theory. So again, if we're, thinking about the history of Black studies, like just generally as a field, I mean, we were thinking certainly about race and power and capitalism and diaspora. But, Black feminist scholars really pushed us. They asked us, like, what happens not just when we're centering race and power and capitalism, but what happens when we center Black women's bodies, right? Black women's religious experiences, Black women's storytelling. So I think of my work as really growing out of that particular intervention, right? So again, going back to the movements, first movement, Gullah Geechee culture, women, live memory, right? I'm like pushing those boundaries, like, but I'm also saying, well, if Black women's sacred experiences don't fit our definitions, and maybe our definitions are the problem, right? And then,
Yeah.
but then moving and thinking about embodiment, which is what Black feminism and womanism really gives, us a fantastic lens into. And then thinking about how theological ideas then circulate through popular culture to shape our understanding of Black women's embodiment. I mean, all of those things, what I hope my work does and where I think that interventions can happen, I think is to contribute to, I don't know, I think a deeper insistence that the sacred isn't marginal to Black life, is central. And I think that, so when you said, oh, it's really great to have somebody who does religious studies in Black studies, right? Black religious studies, wanting to get, because we haven't heard enough. I think that's true. I think we have very kind of narrow conceptions of what Black religious life means. Thank God for sinners, right? Kind of putting that in a popular imaginary.
That's interesting. You're right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that, this idea of stretching, right? This idea of always moving. I think that we have to do that work. I mean, what if, scholarship doesn't end at a journal article? What if theory is film? What if archives are installations that get us to think about this? So, what if research becomes, something that everybody from your hometown can watch and recognize themselves in, right? So I really see my work as honoring the field's past with a particular kind of niche, in some ways, a focus on religious expression. But when Black studies, that, the work that Arthur Fawcett was doing on Black gods of the metropolis is not just marginal to Black studies. It's like central. When you think about the work that Benjamin Elijah Mays and all those folks are doing, but at the same time, so it's like paying honor to that and homage to that. It's certainly embracing and celebrating it, but it's also like pushing, like how can we get broader publics in more expansive forms of Black religious expression? I mean, that I'd like to think is where I help to stretch the field.
I think given the way you described the field as born moving makes this actually kind of a complicated question, if I can just be a theorist for a minute.
Yeah,
So
sure.
It's like, what does it mean to talk about like how it fits in the past of the field and what horizons does it open? Well, if the field is born moving, sort of you just described that how where you fit is also where you boundary push, right? It's that you're part of this particular mobile set of ideas in space that are responding to, questions of spirituality and religion, but also, questions of language, questions of sound, questions of community, right? Which is really in some ways like the guiding thread of so much of Black studies. And so So I like the way that your very way of describing it was sort of fleshing out that notion of born moving, right?
Yeah.
That you moved right in and out of those foundations, and like you said, I mean, it is always really striking to me how underrepresented in the field of Black studies, how underrepresented religious studies is, given the
Agreed.
significance of religion in the Atlantic world, and so we have quite a few really great people, so I think we're starting to build a pretty good testimony to it. But just think there can't be enough. But also, this is where if anybody's listening and thinking about hiring, it needs to also be a hiring priority.
Yeah.
We need to represent it in the curriculum and in our department, list of specialties.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. I mean, I'm at UNC Chapel Hill. We're just admitting our second cohort of graduate students, PhD program, in Africana Studies. And, the questions that students are asking, right? Prospective students are asking, so many of those questions are informed, and if not informed, are the flat out religious studies questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially in this kind of moment too. It's like top of mind is like, how do I make sense of this world, and how do I help my communities make sense of it? Well, that's exploration of the sacred for sure.
And my example, when people, if people ever press me on that, I'm like, look, what is the single most commonly thought of important foundational, whatever you want to call it, canonical text of Black studies would be Souls of Black Folk.
That's right.
It starts off with musical notation from the
That's
spirituals.
Right.
That's not just Du Bois was not. He did things deliberately. I'll just leave it at that.
That's right.
So maybe that's worth thinking about.
I mean, we could ask, whether I'm not a Du Boisian scholar in that way, but did he have whimsical sensibilities about certain things? Perhaps, but by and large, yeah, his sense of intent was pretty bar none.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, again, like you said, that would require a significant biographical sort of dive into his character.
Yeah.
All I know is I once, because I was in Amherst, Mass, so just down the road was his archive, and did a sort of curiosity dive one summer into the letter exchanges around his daughter's marriage to County Cullen. And there were extended debates about the size of the top hats among groom and family. And so if that's any indicator, I think he was a details-oriented guy.
Details. just little detail-oriented. Just a smidge,
Very serious about these top hats.
These top hats.
He looks great in a top hat, so I get it.
Yeah.
Well, let me follow up then just a little bit on your question about your research. Your doctoral work was in religious studies, which is a disciplinary education, but I think religious studies is interesting to think about, discipline and non-discipline. But your appointments have been in Black studies departments, religion departments, also women and gender studies departments. And I'm interested in how you think that movement sort of between discipline and non-discipline has impacted how you conceive and then execute a research project. And also, if you want, how it has shaped how you conceive a classroom.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really rich question, John. I would say that thinking about religious studies and the training that it gave me as a discipline, right? That disciplinary education is key because it taught me how to read closely, right? And I would say that religious studies taught me how to historicize, right? And I already had a really great foundation because I was a history major, right? As an undergrad, right? So really it's just like amping up, the elements that were already there. And the piece that I think that religion really, really helped me do was to attend in careful and thoughtful ways to theology, to ritual, and to metaphysics, right? So my first book is Talking to the Dead. And people are like, well, how do you do that? Is there a process, how do you do this thing? And I say all the time, and it unsettles folks. Well, it's a metaphysical process to think about what it means to connect with an ancestral presence or force. And so that training, I think, matters. It matters because it gave me tools. And as an aside, I am a religious studies scholar who also is seminary trained. Now, there's probably a whole podcast to unpack about how I probably should have done an MA in religion, but I didn't know any better, basically. And I
Huh.
went to seminary. And shout out to the late Michael Joseph Brown, who just passed away recently, a couple months ago, um, tragically young. But he was like, "Girl, what are you doing here in this seminary when you should be doing an MA in religion?" He was like, "Well, since you're here, though, let's get you ready for thinking about a PhD." And I tell you, my seminary training courses, again, some of the most helpful material that have gotten in a classroom context to date. And it informs how it is that I think about my classrooms. And what I mean by that is we had to take things like pastoral care. Well, damn it, if being an academic isn't pastoral care, if educating minds isn't pastoral care, I don't know what
Mm,
is,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So I would say that, that training gave me some really important tools. But I would also say that my appointments in Africana studies and women's studies and gender studies, these spaces that are intentionally interdisciplinary, have also taught me something that I always known to be true as a child of Gwen, my mother, and Bill, my father, as a daughter of Phyllis and a granddaughter of Phyllis and Annie Mae, my grandmothers, and as a daughter of Moncks Corner, South Carolina, that there isn't really a single discipline that's sufficient to understand Black life. Black life isn't easily contained, right? And so when your intellectual home is interdisciplinary, I think you learn to ask different questions. That born moving, I think you learn to move. I think you learn to embrace rather than be confined by kind of structures that would tell you that you can only move certain ways. So you learn to see how embodiment and religion and media and history and politics, they're not separate. They're braided together, right? And so that braided sensibility certainly informs my research, but I would say it also informs my teaching, right? I'm not afraid to shift mediums, right? Whether I'm thinking monograph, whether I'm thinking anthology, whether I'm thinking op-ed, whether I'm thinking documentary, because the questions determine the form for me, right? And so
Mhm.
filmmaking in particular has really expanded how I think about knowledge production, right? It requires attention to voice and image and pacing and audience. It's a reminder for me that scholarship is not just about argument, it's about feeling and access and resonance. I mean, that's also religious studies, right? And that carries me into the classroom. So I'm always asking my students to read theory and I'm asking them to watch film. I'm asking them to sit with archives and I'm asking them with music. But this is what
Mhm.
most of us in Black studies are doing.
Yeah.
But I'm also I'm asking them to think critically, but I'm also asking them to reflect on what moves them, right? I want
Mm,
my students to understand that Black studies isn't something that you just analyze. It's something that you inhabit. It's
mhm.
it's something that isn't about guarding boundaries, right? It's more about cultivating depth and rigor and imagination where those questions lead. So that is, I guess if I had to kind of really summarize that in a brief way, I would say that, for me and how it is that I teach in particular, I'm creating a learning environment for students to recognize that Black studies is a way of thinking, but it's really a way of being.
Yeah.
It's a way of being. Black studies is a way of being.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I love that. Cultivating that sense of Black studies as a way of being is a way as you just described of connecting students to uh, the political and existential significance of what they're doing,
Yeah.
but also
Yeah.
to the highest aspirations of education. I mean, education is supposed to be about the whole person, and I that description of Black studies as an education and engagement with the whole person
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, and think about that's a shout out to June Jordan. June Jordan, that essay, Bringing Back the Person, when she's thinking about
Yeah.
what it means to be in the space of Black studies in higher education. I mean, it's just like, yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Perfect. I have two more questions for
Yeah.
you, sort of big, broad questions.
Yeah.
The first one, what do you think that the field of Black studies has historically done well,
Yeah.
and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. I especially appreciate that you're asking this question about what it has not done well, because I think that we need to do a better job of actually saying what what we've not done so well.
Yeah.
I would say that the things that Black studies has done really well is I think it's done something pretty extraordinary, and I think it's shifted culture. Which is really, really hard to do. I mean, I think
Mhm.
it's fundamentally altered how universities think about knowledge and knowledge production, how institutions think about legitimacy. I think, it has shifted culture by cultivating these young, brilliant minds, Black students, white students, non-white, everybody, right? I think it's cultivated brilliant minds who have been scholars and organizers and educators and artists, who've really gone on to shape public discourse and policy and art and theology and media, right? So I think it's done the extraordinary thing is it's pushed institutions to do more. And I think we're seeing that impact right now, right? I
Mhm.
think that is
For sure.
precisely why we're seeing such an intense backlash, right, on higher education. I think that focus on destabilizing and eliminating Black studies, right? And of course, we can think about the attacks on the AP, African American Studies course, but we could also go to last week, right? The shuttering of African and African diaspora studies at places like UT Austin, right?
Yeah.
These aren't coincidences, right? You don't attack something unless it's powerful. You don't try to eliminate something
Exactly.
unless it's working, right? And so Black studies has been so effective at unsettling institutions, right? And shifting cultures. And I think that is one of its greatest strengths. Now, what we haven't done as well, I I would say that I think as Black studies has become more professionalized and institutionalized, that we've lost touch with each other across disciplines. I
Mm.
think that we've become more siloed than we should be. I think we've also, I mean, to your point about, there not being as many kind of scholars of religion, kind of in this larger, broader, maybe more popular, perhaps, kind of landscape, right, of how we think about Black studies. We usually think about historians. We think about the scholars of literature in English and rhetoric, and we think about culture study. We don't always think about religious studies, right, to your point. But I think that we've also lost at times um, that grassroots community-based engagement. I think professionalization has brought its advantages, right? There are resources, there's stability, there's legitimacy, right? But I also think that we have encountered now, I think, a dangerous distance from the communities that gave birth to the field. So before we started recording, I was talking to you. I was like, oh, yeah, you're asking me how long I've been at UNC. And I was like, oh, I've been here since, 2023. And what I didn't say in that was, my time at Williams was fantastic. I don't have anything bad to say about my time at Williams. It was really great. It was wonderfully professional, and wonderfully generative for my career. But it's also, as we were saying, that, I had to take a moment to think about how I would be able to do work that would really impact the communities that matter to me in a place that's so prestigious and kind of isolated
Mhm.
from that world, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that we haven't done as well. We, we've gotten a kind of dangerous distance from the communities that gave birth to the field. And so I think when that distance grows, our ability to shift culture and push institutions weakens. I think then that the challenge before us, and we have lots of challenges in this moment, but I think that for me, again, just holding up these constructive, tensions, right? Like, how do we maintain intellectual rigor and institutional presence without losing relational accountability, right? Like, how do we stay brilliant, but also how do we stay grounded? And I think that balance is really, really crucial. I think it's essential. And I think we haven't done that as well as we can because we've been doing the important work of professionalization and department making and building and institutionalization. But there's a cost to that.
Well, I'm glad you took the what is not done particularly well in the most generous sense. I think sometimes people feel a little put on the spot, but as you point out, I mean, it's like what maybe hasn't been done particularly well, or that we need to be mindful of thinking about the field going forward. So often those things go back to origins, right?
Yes.
As you said, it's like this is where we started. What would it mean to return to this in really strong ways, especially in a time of crisis in terms of institutionalization?
Yeah.
I've said this many times, like, who are our allies, and what does it mean if the only allies are some people in some departments rather than the sense of, this is me editorializing, but I doubt you would disagree, but it's the part of the real moral authority of Black studies is its origin story.
That's right.
And to have lost that origin story, or to have frayed sort of relationships to that kind of origin, is to have a frayed relationship to what is a real sort of moral clarity and authority. Authority may be the wrong word, but of the field, right, and its righteousness. And so I love this as a reminder to not think, well, we can talk about community stuff later after we save the field from attack, but
That's
instead, like, this is a part of the whole package.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that part of our challenge is, one, to make sure that people understand that it's not malicious, right? It's not because people in Black studies in higher education don't care about communities. Nobody would say that, but it's more of it's almost, it's like any relationship, right? It's like you can just we both have kids. You know what happens in your marriage. If you're not paying attention and you're not focusing and everything becomes about what's going on with the kids, you're like, oh, wait, when's the last time we talked again? And it's not because you don't love each other, don't care. It's like wanting to make sure that you build those relationships and you always sustain them. And yeah, I think that is instructive for the things that we could, really stand to do some tending. And I think we need to do tending in this moment because we need those communities to also be championing us.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe that's already partially an answer to this last question, which is sort of thinking in a Black studies context. What is the one question you would want us to all be asking, or the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I knew you were going to still ask me this question. I think I was hoping that you would. Not for any particular reason, because there are just so many big questions. I think,
there really are.
There's so many questions. I think, though, at the heart of what feels most urgent for me right now is translation. So I would say that the kind of big question that feels especially urgent to me is, how are we translating our knowledge, our methods, our archives, our theories, and how are we translating them into action, into community impact, into legacy, right? If Black studies has taught us anything, it is that knowledge is not neutral. It does work. So, like, what work is our scholarship doing beyond the page? Right? What is it doing? Like, are we building institutions that will outlast us? Are we mentoring students in ways that prepare them to not only like analyze the world, but to transform it? Right? Are we creating archives that our children, our children's children will inherit? And I think about legacy often, right? I think about what that means, not only because now you and I are likely alike in this way, that like our students are our children's age, and then like our children are now like almost older than our students, so it's like, so thinking about legacy and what it means for that next generation feels really important. For my own children, like, what are they going to inherit? And I don't want them to only inherit critique. I want them to inherit possibility. I really do. I want them to inherit possibility. And I think about my my oldest son, who will be 13 this year. And I remember just kind of like a year and a half ago asking him, his name is Cy, C-Y. And I was like, Cy, you know, I know that it's really early, but like, you've been on a lot of college campuses, right? I mean, he's a parent, he's a child of two academics, he goes to conferences.
They live a weird life. I got two of those myself. So.
No, they live a weird life. There was one point I was doing this fellowship at Harvard, and he asked me, I mean, he was young. I mean, I guess that was probably like, so if he's 13, he'll be 13 this year, 12, 11, 10. He was probably about 10. And he was like, oh, can I go? He was like asking, I was at a workshop, and he was like, can I go on my own across Harvard's campus? And I was like, no, because he didn't have a phone. He didn't even have a watch. He didn't have any way of getting in touch with me. And I was like, why would you ask that question? He was like, well, I know where the student union is, and I know where the center of campus is. And so I know if I can get, and I was like, oh, you understand the geography of a college campus. Of course you do, right? But the reason I'm bringing that up, I was like, I asked him kind of tongue in cheek. I was like, oh, what do you think you would, like, would you go to college? Like, and he was like, I'm not going to college. And I was like, excuse me? Wait, I was like offended. I said, what did you say? I was like a very, 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 for real Black mama. I said, excuse me? What do you mean? And he was like, well, I've already been, and I majored in Africana studies.
Amazing.
And I was like, oh my God. One, I felt very proud. I was like, my baby majored in Africana studies. But the fact that he felt, one, comfortable in the space of a higher education, very prestigious institution. And he's like, I can walk around on this campus. That's its own thing, right? But it, to me, was a reminder that the questions of Black studies are not just theoretical. They're practical, right? We need to be asking ourselves, how do we sustain Black studies under pressure? How do we protect it? How do we make it more public facing? How do we make it more porous? How do we ensure it's accountable to the communities that demanded its creation, but to Cy, my son, right? And so, like, how do we make sure that what we're building now is something that the next generation can stand on and not have to rebuild from scratch, which is really my worry. My worry is that they're going to have to rebuild in a way that I hope that they won't, right? And so for me, that translation piece feels really important to answering that question. Like, are we building, institutions that are going to outlast us? How are we translating our knowledge? How are we doing that work? And how are we doing that work into legacy making? So for me, that's the big question that's top of mind.
What a great place to end. I love that. That's a question. What I like about the question is all the weight that you put in it, and it requires us to think big, but also to think big about ourselves and about the people we work with and the kind of collective and individual work we do. So thank you for that. And, Ron, I really love your work. I just have so much respect for it. I love your intellectual adventurousness. And so I was really looking forward to this conversation, and it's just been absolutely perfect. It was everything I was hoping it would be. So thank you for your time, but really thank you for your generosity and thoughtfulness throughout this. This is a fantastic contribution to the series.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me. And, when you invited me, I was like, finally, I made it. I made it. I get to go on the Black Studies podcast. I'm serious. I listen to the podcast. I subscribe to the podcast now for a long time. So, I'm really honored to help make a contribution. And really my hope is that this work is its own archive, its own legacy making, right? I hope that's how you all are thinking of it.
Absolutely.
Leaving its own mark, its own contribution. I'm really humbled, honestly, to have been able to, contribute in some way. So thank you truly for having me. I'm honored. I love this. Thank you for this conversation. And it gave me an excuse to kind of think, like, we're always kind of in the work, right? And so taking that moment to reflect. So thank you for also posing some really important, provocative questions. I will just say one last thing, which is a shout out to Alton Pollard III, who is a distinguished professor at Wake Forest University, and was really formational to my time when I was in seminary. And he said something that I've never forgotten, and I invoke it often enough for people to be like, okay. And he was like, our charge in the work that we do is to disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed, right? And I feel like if we are taking that sensibility and carrying it with us in Black Studies, then we can do that legacy work for sure. We're meant to provoke, but we're also meant to create and to do it in ways that's sustaining. So thank you for giving me an opportunity, honestly, to reflect on that a little bit.
Our pleasure as the editorial collective, but every listener's privilege really to have this. So thank you so much, and give my best to your people, and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.